Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to this explainer. If you've ever felt like Old Testament law and New Testament grace were just two completely different, totally incompatible systems, you are definitely not alone. But today, we're exploring a brilliantly argued essay by Marc Bates called The Torah as Prophetic Narrative. We're going to uncover what the biblical text itself actually says, because the paradigm shift we are about to explore, it is truly remarkable. For the longest time, Western culture has carried around this massive misconception. On the left here, we see the standard post-Enlightenment view. We tend to treat the Torah, the Law of Moses, as this rigid manual of jurisprudence, like it's a massive rulebook, or maybe a ladder that people were supposed to climb to earn their salvation. But Bates argues for what he calls a text-immanent view, which you'll see on the right. When you actually look at the literary structure Moses used, the Torah isn't a static statutory code at all. It actually functions as a prophetic narrative and as diagnostic wisdom. It wasn't designed to save people. It was designed to show them exactly why they needed saving.
So here's our structural roadmap for today. We'll start with beyond a rulebook, then look at a prophetic blueprint, move into the idea of a mirror, not a ladder, then we'll discuss the Messiah as the Telos, and finally, the new covenant heart. Don't worry, we're going to unpack this step by step.
All right, Section 1, Beyond a Rulebook. Let's reframe how we see the Law of Moses. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the actual language. Since the Reformation, we've had this habit of slicing the law into neat, separate little boxes: moral, civil, ceremonial. But if we look at the Hebrew root of the word Torah, which is Yarah, we discover something super surprising. It literally means to shoot an arrow or aim at a mark. The Torah was meant to function as fatherly guidance. It's paradigmatic wisdom, pointing toward a specific goal. It is not, and was never meant to be, an exhaustive statutory code covering every possible infraction. It's more like an instruction manual pointing its reader towards something much, much bigger.
Take Leviticus 19, for example, the famous holiness code. It weaves judicial integrity, market fairness, and the command to love your neighbor into one single unified relational field. The Torah is an organic whole. You couldn't just keep the quote-unquote moral parts and ignore the rest of it. And because it's a unified whole demanding perfect covenantal holiness, it actually functions as a diagnostic mirror. It reflects God's perfection and exposes the deep, underlying sickness of the human heart. It was never a ladder to climb. It was a mirror meant to show us a reflection we couldn't possibly fix on our own.
Moving right along to Section 2, a prophetic blueprint. Let's look at the text architecture. To really grasp this, we have to zoom out and look at the macro architecture of the biblical text. Moses didn't just throw a bunch of random stories and laws together. The guy was a master architect, intentionally designing a narrative. Notice the timeline here. Hebraic literary composition often puts the interpretive keys at the very boundaries of a work. So Moses deliberately frames the giving of the law at Sinai with stories of massive, undeniable failure. On one end, Genesis 1 through 11 shows universal human failure, culminating at Babel. In the middle, you get Sinai. And then on the other end, in Deuteronomy 29 through 34, you have national failure. Moses flat out predicts that Israel is going to rebel and go into exile. By sandwiching Sinai between human rebellion and predicted national exile, Moses is proving that the Sinai covenant was absolutely never intended to be the ultimate remedy.
This perfectly illustrates a brilliant rabbinic concept known as Maaseh Avot, which means the deeds of the fathers are assigned to the sons. It's a patterned history. Just look at the correspondence between Adam and Israel here. Adam is placed in a sanctuary garden. Israel is placed in the promised land. Adam is given a specific command. Israel is given the Sinai stipulations. Adam fails and gets expelled eastward. Israel fails and gets exiled eastward to Babylon. You see the pattern? Moses literally wrote Adam's story as a prophetic blueprint for Israel's identical failure.
So what does this all mean? If the text is actively predicting failure, where is the ultimate hope? Well, Moses strategically inserted these massive poetic seams at major narrative joints throughout the Pentateuch, and they are marked by the Hebrew phrase Akarit Hayamim, meaning the end of days. From Jacob's blessing of Judah way back in Genesis 49 to Balaam's prophecies in Numbers 24, the Torah shifts our gaze away from our present inability, and it relocates all our hope onto a future coming Messiah King from the line of Judah.
Which brings us to Section 3, Mirror, not a ladder. What was the true role of the law? If Moses knew the people couldn't keep the Sinai covenant, and if it couldn't permanently cure the human heart, why in the world did God give it at all? The Apostle Paul actually perfectly understood Moses' embedded structure.
In Galatians 3:24, he writes, "So then, the law was our guardian until Christ came." The Greek word he uses there for guardian is paidagōgos. Paul isn't making up new theology here. He's reading Moses exactly the way Moses intended to be read.
To really get Paul's point, we have to look at the cultural context of a Greco-Roman paidagōgos. This was not the friendly headmaster, and it wasn't the primary teacher. This was a strict supervisory slave who often carried a literal stick. Their job was to restrain, escort, and ultimately deliver a rebellious child safely to the true teacher. That was the historical role of the law. It defined transgression, it temporarily corralled a rebellious people, and it conclusively demonstrated that human effort couldn't save them. It escorted them until the promised seed, the Messiah, finally arrived on the scene.
And that leads right into Section 4, Messiah as the Telos, the ultimate goal. So the crucial point is this: how exactly does Jesus relate to the original intent of the Torah? Did he just scrap it and start completely over? Not at all. It all hinges on this word, telos. In Greek, telos means the goal, the climax, or the culmination toward which something aims. It doesn't just mean termination or abolition. Think of it like the finish line of a marathon. Crossing the finish line doesn't abolish the race, it's the entire reason the race was run in the first place. Christ didn't abolish the law, he is its intended destination. The Messiah is the Torah's telos. This completely unlocks Romans 10:4, which says, "For Christ is the telos of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes." So often, we read Christ is the end of the law, and our brains just hear abolition. But if we read telos as a teleological culmination, we realize he is the target, the arrow of the Torah was shooting at all along. Reading it this way perfectly honors Moses' original prophetic frame.
And this is exactly why Jesus speaks the way he does in Matthew 5. He famously says, "I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." To abolish is kataluo, a word that was heavily associated in Jewish memory with national apostasy. Jesus emphatically denies doing this. Instead, he uses plero, to fulfill. He came to bring those long prophetic trajectories to their ultimate goal. He came to actualize the divine will at the deepest possible level of the human heart, recovering the true relational holiness that Leviticus 19 was aiming at from the start.
Finally, Section 5, the New Covenant Heart. Let's look at the Spirit's work.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because if the Torah diagnosed the deadly disease of the human heart, how does the Messiah actually cure it? Notice how this unfolds through what scholars call the Promise Plan, a single organically growing divine word. Moses warns back in Deuteronomy 29 that rebellious hearts lead straight to exile. But then, immediately in chapter 30, he promises God will one day circumcise their hearts. Fast forward, and Jeremiah 31 expands this, saying the Torah will be written directly inside them, and Ezekiel 36 specifies exactly how, through the indwelling Spirit. So the New Covenant doesn't destroy God's instruction, it changes the substrate. The law moves from cold stone tablets that can be broken to living, beating hearts empowered by the Spirit. And what's truly spectacular here is who gets to participate. Bates points out that internalizing the Torah in the Messiah doesn't cancel ethnic Israel's covenantal identity, not at all. Using the Apostle Paul's imagery of the olive tree, Gentile believers are grafted into the Abrahamic promise alongside ethnic Israel. It beautifully unites Jewish and Gentile believers in the Messiah. Gentiles aren't replacing Israel. We are joining the commonwealth of the one people of God, just like Genesis 12 promised when it said all families of the earth would be blessed. So, we have to end by asking ourselves this really provocative question. Is Christian liberty simply an antinomian license to do whatever we want, totally ignoring the Old Testament? Or is true Christian liberty an empowered allegiance to the Messiah King Jesus, whose very yoke is the living culmination of Moses' hope? The Torah was never just a dead rulebook, guys. It was a prophetic arrow, and it was always pointing directly at him. I hope this shared discovery brings a whole new depth to how you read the first 5 books of your Bible. Keep learning, keep digging, and we'll see you in the next explainer.